right, thanks everyone for joining us today. Hope you're having a great first day of BCB. It's good to be back, and thanks for everyone for participating in Park Street University. We're going to talk about the state of spirits in 2026. As Emmett mentioned, my name is Sarah. I'm the Director of Supplier Development at Park Street, so overseeing Park Street University, all of our education, content, trade marketing, standard marketing, and then business development as well. So over the years, nearly 12 years with Park Street now, have spoken probably to thousands of brands on all things U.S. route to market and making changes, entering, et cetera. So excited to share some of the latest and greatest for this year with you guys all here today. We're going to talk specifically about navigating the quote-unquote new normal and the spirits industry in 2026. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Just a quick overview. We're going to talk about Gen Z moderation and the low/no movement, the U.S. dietary guidelines and alcohol, distributor consolidation and emerging paths forward, M&A activity, what's going on right now, and strategic takeaways for your brand. And I did see a couple people taking pictures, so just want to share for all of the presenters, you can scan the QR code. We publish everything. You can get it for totally free after the show and on an ongoing basis. All right, so talking first about Gen Z moderation and the low and no movement, the narrative that we hear time and time again with respect to Gen Z is that they're the quote-unquote sober generation and that the low and no movement is really the next dominant force in the industry. Just like anything, when you dive into the specifics a bit further, it tends to be more nuanced than that, although it is fair to say that Gen Z certainly behaves differently than prior generations like millennials and Gen X, and they are in fact drinking. It's just different than what we've seen previously. So first up, 70% of the US Gen Z reported drinking alcohol in the first half of 2025. This was a noted uptick from the 46% that was calculated in 2023. I think it's also important to frame this conversation that Gen Z is currently 14 to 29-year-olds. So for the LDA, the legal drinking age of 21 in the United States, we only have about half of the generation that is able to drink. So this is very much still emerging statistics, emerging behaviors that we need to track as we have a large section. Thank you. As we have a large section of the population there that are still coming of legal drinking age. We also should note that it's important that of those that are legal drinking age for Gen Z, that they really spent many of their formative years during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that understandably has shaped a lot of choices and whatnot. And we all experienced that here, but again, not necessarily during our formative years, which I think is an important point to make. That being said, Gen Z isn't abandoning alcohol. We feel that they're redefining it. They're drinking on fewer occasions as well as those that are different. So for example, if you think about brunch as an emerging category, a lot of festivals, think of Coachella and ones like that, just becoming different than maybe we've seen alcohol traditionally consumed. When they do drink, it is of higher quality, and they're also making more intentional choices. So we've talked for a large number of years, I feel, about authenticity and storytelling, but given the importance to this generation, that's more important than ever before, and something that is, I think, important to highlight as we look at how to access the Gen Z consumer in particular. It's no question that low and no is growing. It's nearly $6 billion annually as of the latest data in 2025 at a 4.7% CAGR anticipated through 2035. That being said, that's still a relatively small share of the alcohol beverage industry. And if you can even capture just a slice of that large pie, if you will, it's certainly relevant. Ultimately, we see low and no as something that is supplementing alcohol rather than replacing it. Okay, and then wrapping up this slide with the shift, we see it again as format and occasion, not necessarily abstinence, putting an emphasis on certain subcategories like flavored spirits, RTDs, and lower ABV products are some that are the fastest growing categories, and that's specifically because Gen Z as a consumer group is gravitating towards them. And especially with an emphasis on the on-premise, which I know is part of the discussions that we've had here, we actually see Gen Z outperforming other cohorts in terms of their frequency and their visits to the on-premise. It puts a further emphasis on the importance of in-person experiences, again, especially as we're still coming out fully from the pandemic, getting bars and those in-person experiences and occasions to capture Gen Z and other consumers as well at large. Okay, so we'll head over to the U.S. dietary guidelines and moderation for beverage alcohol. Even going back a few years prior, so there was an article, I think, in the drinks business, it was last week, that the European World Health Organization in 2023 declared a no safe level of consumption for beverage alcohol. That was a change in discussion from the 20 years leading up to that, where we talked more about quote unquote harmful use of alcohol. I think it's important to note that the things that grab headlines are not the kind of lukewarm, type of feedback with respect to the industry. Things that, kind of paint things in a more negative picture, have more maybe fear-mongering associated with it, is what's going to get more into the mainstream media. That being said, we've seen some relevant changes somewhat recently that's positive for the industry, including mainstream news outlets and even publications like GQ, for example, picking up opinion pieces, talking about the importance of even social health as it pertains to alcohol. Then there were particular concerns at the end of the Biden administration, the previous president here in the United States, because of the strong Surgeon General's warning that came out at that time against alcohol. And so there was concerns with the current administration under President Trump what the new dietary guidelines for Americans would look like. But we are happy to see that the guidance is less absolute than what it had been previously. So instead of talking about a fixed daily drink limit, we are simply told to consume less. And I think it's important to think about the fact that the alcohol industry, at least from my experience in being in it, has always advocated for moderation. And that's something that was important, is important, and will continue to be important, and something that we always talk about with respect to the industry. And there's an important distinction there between responsible drinking and heavy versus harmful use and how we frame that. In fact, the National Academies of Sciences recently reaffirmed the benefits of alcohol on social health. So again, when we look back at Gen Z, the pandemic, et cetera, high rates of anxiety, depression, social isolation, certainly no one here is advocating that alcohol will solve severe mental health issues. However, those people seeking meaningful in-person experiences and to have meaningful social connection with friends, families, and peers, alcohol can be a responsible part of that and having a meaningful social life. So we think that that is something that is a positive shift. As we're talking about shifts and the shifting landscape, obviously a lot happening recently at the distribution tier here in the United States with respect to consolidation, cuts, and then what that means for new paths forwards. Probably one of the biggest headlines that we saw in the industry this past year was RNDC, which was formerly the second largest wine and spirits distributor, quickly move out of California and overall really collapse as a distribution force. They just recently closed a deal to sell operations to 11 markets to Reyes Beverage Group that has historically been a beer distributor up until this point. With that acquisition, it brings Reyes' footprint to 15 states plus Washington, D.C. So that means that Reyes covers 52% of the legal drinking age population in the United States, which is quite meaningful. Then we also have Breakthrough Beverage Group, one of the other largest distributors here in the U.S., cut hundreds of jobs in the last year or so, particularly those that focused on craft spirits brands and those that are more entrepreneurial in nature. And then wrapping up at the distribution side, Southern Glazers has and continues to be the largest alcoholic beverage distributor in the United States. They furthered that national footprint when earlier this year in March, they acquired Claire Rose, distributor in Long Island, as well as Eagle Rock in Colorado. And so I think it's interesting because there's a lot changing at the distribution level, but then we also saw some interesting conversations at the supplier tier. And I find that particularly interesting because if you look back on the distributor consolidation that we've seen over the last couple of decades in the US, that was really a byproduct and a response to the increased consolidation, at the supplier tier. And so now we kind of see it back on the other end of the spectrum. While this didn't come to fruition, to see Sazerac and Pernod Ricard's bidding war over Brown-Forman, which is kind of an interesting swing and something that we might want to note as we move forward in 2026 and beyond to see if there's more of those conversations popping up. That being said, with all of this, we always want to look at what are the opportunities, right, and how can brands adapt. So if you have traditionally been with a beer and wine distributor, that's now looking into spirits, it's an opportunity maybe to negotiate a different contract, work with some different salespeople, penetrate markets differently than you have been, or enter new ones as a result of that. We've also seen platform alternatives. Park Street is one. There's others out there as well. Brands that want to use the clearing distribution model, whether that's on an interim basis to fulfill a gap like the RNDC California situation, to test the market, develop their proof of concept. It's certainly a way to be able to enter a market and invest more heavily in your sales and marketing initiatives. And we've seen operators report about 20 and 30% growth respectively in the on and off premise, because they are able to deepen relationships with those particular channels. Okay. Everyone always likes to hear quite a bit about M&A. There was a flurry of activity for a number of years in the Bev Alc space. That certainly quieted a little bit, but we still have seen some interesting activity, especially with those brands that align well with the Gen Z consumer. So you can see on the chart up here, we have the list of buyers and respective sellers. So in 2025, AB InBev took a stake in Beatbox. I was fortunate to hear the Beatbox founder speak at an industry conference earlier this year. He spoke a lot about their format, targeting festivals, things like that. Again, a lot of those things that really speak to the Gen Z consumer, leading to that success. Tito's made its first acquisition in Lalo Tequila, and then also Gallo's purchase of Whiny Baby. Then going into early 2026, we saw quite a bit of activity with Sazerac. Again, Dirty Shirley was something that they invested in March. They took a stake in Kendall Jenner's 818 Tequila in April, and also invested in Sipmargs in May. So again, circling back to these trends that are coming up time and time again, RTDs, celebrity-backed, and Gen Z targeted brands are more relevant than ever before. In addition, Molson Coors bought Monaco Cocktails, Constellation acquired Hopwater, and Tilray also struck a deal with BrewDog. So we know, and we've seen this before with M&A activity, that the strategics are aware that entrepreneurs are really the ones to do the brand building effectively rather than their R&D departments. While we're seeing less activity, we're also seeing acquisitions happening earlier in the brand's life cycle. And so that's something that's very interesting, and ultimately, those brands that can target the Gen Z consumer effectively are ones that we are really seeing the most success. So putting this all together with some strategic takeaways and what this means for your brand, and just thinking about distribution and before you commit to anything. So we're probably all aware the United States is a highly regulated industry for alcoholic beverages. Could have an entire session just on that topic alone. But as it pertains to distribution in particular, I think it's important to think about open versus control states. So there's about 18 states in the United States that are controlled for spirits brands. That means that the Liquor Control Board or equivalent in the state needs to accept the product in, and then they will be evaluating certain performance metrics on a regular basis. If the brand does not meet those performance metrics, it's very likely to get delisted in the state. And once a brand is delisted, it's nearly impossible to get relisted at a later date. That doesn't mean you can't or you shouldn't go into those states, but it's something to be mindful of. Fortunately, many major markets, including New York, where we are today, is an open market. Other large markets like California and Florida are as well. Second, when we think about franchise versus non-franchise states, some states, notoriously Georgia, Tennessee, for example, are major franchise markets for distribution. That means that there's an additional layer of protection for the distributor within that state. It's extremely difficult to exit those contracts once you've signed on. Again, doesn't mean that you can't do that or that there's a right or wrong, but these are things to consider before you jump into that particular state when you think about these additional layers of regulatory compliance. And then that, coupled with the increased consolidation at the top with the distributors, means that there's fewer but larger books. And so it's even more important for that reason to think about which partner you're choosing to go with and why. And then that segues over, I think, to thinking about the size of your brand and the right distributor fit. So a lot of these mega distributors can really make or break a smaller brand. They're going to have thousands of SKUs in their portfolio. It's very difficult to get your fair share of attention as a smaller or more entrepreneurial brand. And so you can get caught up a little bit in kind of that small fish in a big pond type of concept. But there are other opportunities, whether you're looking at platform models or regional independent type distributors, to be a little bit of a bigger fish in a small pond, get some more real-time feedback as well as focus, and also test marketing your brand a bit further. So something to look out there. Ultimately, there's really no silver bullet or one-size-fits-all type of strategy. There's brands that have had success as well as failures on both sides of the equation, but just some different food for thought there, specifically with distribution. And then just kind of pulling it all together, the formats that we really see winning right now are those that are having accessible entry points into the category. So whether it's RTDs, flavored spirits, lower ABV products, and those that have Gen Z engagement, we should all be welcoming into the industry as on-ramps rather than threats, because these are going to be products that help get more drinkers of legal drinking age into the category at large, and then likely segue into other alcoholic beverage products. And there still continues to be plenty of M&A activity available for those brands that have the right fit. So with that, I'll wrap things up. Thanks so much for having me, and I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to keep up with the latest beverage alcohol industry insights from Park Street University.